recorded. So so that's just a disclaimer. So this video, this presentation is going to have a lot of scientific concepts in it, but I've tried to keep them quite simple. I've got a couple of videos in there because I really like. I think a video can say a lot in 2 minutes than I could do in an hour. So I do have a number of videos in there. So just to let you know. So let's begin. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, let me know when you can see my screen.
You can see.
Can see it.
Okay, great. So, as I said, today's about the COVID-19 vaccine, or vaccines, because there's a few of them. And it's really to get an understanding of the science behind them in order to make informed decisions and inform others correctly, because these can be life and death decisions. Even if not for us, it could be for somebody else. So why study the vaccine? So it's the biggest issue of the decade that has affected us. It's shut down many countries and economies, and things are just so weird right now, and it's all to do with COVID. And so the vaccine is obviously a big part of that. And it would be straightforward if everybody's in harmony, but I think there's so many conflicting views between people in the world. You know, there's anti-vaxxers and people who are for the vaccine. And even as Christians, there's a lot of conflicting understanding of actually what should we do as Christians? Should we take it? Should we not take it? And there's potentially deadly results, like I said, because the reality is when you're dealing with a virus, it's we're talking about life and death situations potentially. Even if it's for a small amount of people, it's still life and death for them. So it's a very important thing to understand. And it's also a testing issue at the moment. And this treads on the grounds of equality. Do we see others the same as ourselves? Do we value their lives the same way that we value our lives? And also to do with conspiracy theories, you know, is what's being said about the vaccine, is it true, or is it a conspiracy? So general questions about the vaccines, which hope to cover in this presentation. One of them, is it safe? What about the side effects? Why has it come out so quickly? Is it rushed? Isn't it injecting genetic material into our bodies? So that's referring specifically to the mRNA vaccine that has been produced by Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna, I think, and there's a couple of other mRNA vaccines out there. So it's things going around. Is genetic information? Is that really safe? You know. And
sorry,
the
Tom.
last one, yes.
Could someone record this? Is it being recorded?
Yeah, I think this is being recorded.
Yeah, it is being recorded.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. And then the last question is, do I need it as an individual? Okay. So just a mention of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories can only be fought with education. You can only meet wrong with right. Or if it's false information, the only way you can meet it is with the right education. So understanding is the only cure and prevention against conspiracy theories, in order so you can understand before they take hold on you, or if they have taken hold of you, to get you out of there. So this is really a journey of understanding to give clarity and basis to our decisions surrounding the issue of vaccines, particularly in regard to COVID-19, but then this is just a general, it can also apply to other vaccines or other kind of medications. You know, it's a way of thinking, a way of going about reasoning what's going to happen. Okay, so we are going to use some science, but I think the study of science is not to be neglected, as Ellen White tells us in Sons of the Times, March 14th, 1900. It says, yeah, the study of sciences is not to be neglected. Books must be used for this purpose, but they should be in harmony with the Bible, for that is the standard. Books of this character should take the place of many of those now in the hands of students. God is the author of science. Scientific research opens to the mind vast fields of thought and information, enabling us to see God in his created works. Ignorance may try to support skepticism by appeals to science, but instead of doing this, Science contributes fresh evidences of the wisdom and power of God. Rightly understood, science and the written word agree, and each sheds light on the other. Together, they lead us to God by teaching us something of the wise and beneficent laws through which he works. Okay, so I know I'm doing a study on science on the Sabbath, but it's really important for us to understand that this science, understanding the science, will directly impact our lives and potentially our salvation as well. So the correct study of science is, as it says here, enables us to see God in his created works, and together they lead us with God, together the scriptures. Okay, so we're gonna have 2 sessions. So this is the morning, or it's afternoon now for most of us, but I've broken it down into 2 parts. One of them is, in the morning, we're gonna look at the biology of cells, the immune system, and viral infections, because it's important to understand this in order to understand how vaccines work. Okay, and then in the evening, this evening, we'll go through a bit of vaccine history, their production, how they work, and the safety of them. And bear in mind the questions we asked earlier. So we'll revisit those questions at the end of the presentation. And before I go forward, I just want to put a very big disclaimer out here. The information presented here is from informational purposes only and not intended to be or to substitute medical advice. For such advice, medical advice, speak to your medical practitioner. And these presentations are only intended to educate about vaccines, and in particular, the RNA vaccines currently rolled out. So we're going to need to go through a bit of a background, as I said, this morning. Why? So in order to understand the issues surrounding these vaccines, we need to understand a few things. One of them is, how do viruses actually work? How the immune system works in response to the viruses? What RNA is, or what is RNA, because there is an RNA vaccine, and how these vaccines work. So we'll spend a bit of time going through the required background this morning, and we'll then build upon that understanding in the afternoon. So I do hope that you can pay attention. I hope it's not too much for all of you, but hopefully it will be enlightening and engaging enough for you to pay attention through the whole way. Okay, so the first section we're going to look at is just the cells, proteins, DNA, and RNA. So this is just to give us a broad scope of how our bodies work. Okay, we are a body, we're an organism. So like this child is an organism. Okay, so this child is an organism, but the organism is made of organs. Okay, and for example, these are the stomach and the intestines. But the stomach, for example, here is made of other things, which is like the muscle cells, the glands, and all these things. And these muscles are also made of something called tissue. Okay, so you can take a bit of a muscle, you can cut it, and it might not be a full muscle, but it's a part of the muscle, and that's called the tissue. And these tissues, they're ultimately broken down into cells. So cells are kind of like the basic unit of what makes up all these things. And then the cells are made up of molecules, and those molecules are made up of atoms. So there's an organizational structure to things. And so we might be looking at something that's at the cell level, but that directly affects the organism, because the organism is just made of tissues, which are made of cells, which are made of, which has organs, which are made of tissues, and the systems are made of organs, and the organism is finally made up of all these systems combined together. Okay, so this is just another illustration. Okay, a cell is a basic structural and functional unit of a living organism. So think about them like bricks in a house. Okay, so you might have a wall, but that wall is made of bricks, and and a couple of the walls go to make a kitchen, and the kitchen, the living room, and the bedroom and the bathroom, or at a basic level, those are what make up the house. Okay, so again, this is just that kind of that organizing. So cells make up tissue. So you have a group of cells working together. So maybe their job is to secrete something, or their job is to constrict, like muscles or whatever. Then you have organs, which are made up of all these. So they have a lot of different tissues together, make an organ. An organ system works together. and they make the organism. So I think that's straightforward. And just another illustration. I've put this in the slides, which I will share later. But yeah, so this is just all the different organs you can think of are made up of different tissues, which are made up of different cells. Okay, so we're going to focus on the cell because the cell is kind of like the basic unit that makes up all these things. Okay, so this is an example of what a cell looks like. A cell is not just, sometimes a cell is very busy, it's very complicated, and it has so many things in there. It's vibrant and they're not static, so they have all these things moving around, things going in and out. And I did have a video in there showing those things, but for sake of time, I removed it, but I can put it back in for when I share the slides. But you have all these things, and you can see things are moving here. This is a picture taken, but that it doesn't show the movement that goes on, the things moving in and out. Okay. And the important thing here to note is that the proteins do most of the work. So the proteins do all these things, are proteins doing all the work. So the proteins do everything in your cells. Without proteins, nothing moves, nothing gets done in the cell. Okay, so for example, insulin, which is a hormone, it's a type of protein. Okay, and this helps us with regulating sugar. We have antibodies for protection, they're proteins. Hemoglobin, which is for transporting oxygen, again, is a protein. This enzyme, Rubisco, not many people know about it, but it's to do with producing photosynthesis in plants, so making energy in plants. Ferritin for storage. Even when you look at something like spider silk, it's all made of proteins. It's the proteins that give it that function. And this other thing called rhodopsin is actually it's a receptor in your eye. Okay, so this helps you see. Okay, so all these things, and obviously your muscles, moving your muscles, they're all made of proteins. So proteins more or less do everything in your body. So where do these proteins come from? And the answer is that DNA, which is the genetic code, it codes for proteins. So proteins are made from the DNA, and that's the only thing that's the main job of DNA, or the main thing it does is to produce proteins. Okay, that's all that DNA is kind of there for. It's there to produce proteins. Not every part of the DNA produces proteins. Some of them regulate how the proteins are produced, but the fundamental reason for DNA is to produce proteins. Okay, so within a cell, the DNA is stored in something called the nucleus. So the nucleus is this kind of blob in the middle of the cell. And you can see here, when you talk about chromosomes, they're just little packagings of the DNA. So DNA is kind of wrapped in these things called chromosomes. And you can see like here, it's almost like, think about it like a ball of string. So you have a lot of string. If you have so much string, like meters and meters and meters of it, it would just make a mess everywhere. So what you tend to do is you wrap it in a ball to make it neat and package it so you can fit in even in your pocket or something, although it's many meters long. Okay, it's the same thing with DNA. DNA is very, very long, but it can get wrapped and put into these chromosomes, and these are all stored in the nucleus. So they don't move, they don't come out of this place. Okay, they don't come out of this place. So this is the nucleus here, again, in this picture. But the DNA, although it codes for protein, it doesn't really make the protein. What makes the protein is another little part of the cell called the ribosome. And these small dots here, if you can see them, these are the ribosomes, and they're the ones that make the protein. So the question is, how does the DNA here interact with the ribosomes here when the DNA doesn't move from the nucleus and the ribosomes are not inside here? So what happens? How does that actually happen? How is there this transfer of information? How do the ribosomes then make the proteins if the information comes from the DNA, but the ribosomes are all the way out here? So the answer is that there's a molecule called RNA. So RNA, in fact, the M in mRNA, I don't know if you've heard it. Sometimes some people say RNA, some people say mRNA. The M in mRNA it stands for messenger. So RNA is like a messenger between the DNA and the ribosomes where the proteins are made. So the DNA stays in the nucleus, it doesn't move out, but it gets copied into something called RNA, which is almost like you know, like a photocopy of the DNA of imagine like a book. So DNA is like a book, and the RNA is a photocopy of one of the pages. Maybe let's talk about a recipe book. DNA is a recipe book full of thousands of recipes. But to make a recipe, what happens first is someone goes in. You have this book; it's very precious, so you don't want to damage it. So you don't want to pass it around to different people, and you don't want to take it here or spill anything on it. So what you do is you go and you take a photocopy of the page that you need, that you want to make. So let's say you want to make a chocolate cake, for example. You go to the page which says chocolate cake, you take a photocopy of it. So that's like the DNA is the book, RNA is a photocopy. And then this is taken to the ribosome, which is like, let's say a chef. And that chef makes the chocolate cake according to the instructions. The start of the DNA, which is the book, got photocopied into the recipe, which is the RNA, and then into the protein. So this is kind of like, think about it like a recipe book, a copy of the recipe, and this is the cake at the end. Okay. So again, we have the DNA. So this is the DNA, what it looks like. It gets turned in, copies of it get made into this thing called mRNA. So the M stands for messenger. So imagine it's traveling. It's a messenger between the DNA and the protein. Okay, and then from the RNA, it gets turned into a protein. Okay, so the reason why I'm going through this is because we have these mRNA vaccines or RNA vaccines, and we have to remember that they're this part here, they're not the DNA. Okay, and that when we start looking at the, you know, where one of the questions was, isn't it genetic material that's coming in here? This will help us understand what exactly the genetic material is and why it's important to understand which one. It's not DNA, it's mRNA, and it's important to understand that. Okay, so this is just a picture to show you what it looks like. So you can see this is the nucleus. The DNA is in here, where you have something here that's making a copy of the RNA, and then it comes out to this ribosome, which then makes the protein. So you can see the protein is here, the DNA is here, and the RNA is in the middle. It's kind of like the bridge. Okay, so to illustrate this just really, really well, I've got a video, and so I'm gonna play that. I think does it automatically share sound if you're sharing your screen, or do I have to yeah, do I have to change that setting on Zoom? Sorry, just bear with me one moment. Okay, so let me see if this is working. Let me know if it's not working.
Here is a cell, the basic unit of all living tissue. In most human cells, there is a structure called the nucleus. The nucleus contains the genome. In humans, the genome is split between 23 pairs of chromosomes. Each chromosome contains a long strand of DNA, tightly packaged around proteins called histones. Within the DNA are sections called genes. These genes contain the instructions for making proteins. When a gene is switched on, an enzyme called RNA polymerase attaches to the start of the gene. It moves along the DNA, making a strand of messenger RNA out of 3 bases in the nucleus. The DNA code determines the order in which the free bases are added to the messenger RNA. This process is called transcription. Before the messenger RNA can be used as a template for the production of proteins, it needs to be processed. This involves removing and adding sections of RNA. The messenger RNA then moves out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm. Protein factories in the cytoplasm, called ribosomes, bind to the messenger RNA. The ribosome reads the code in the messenger RNA to produce a chain made up of amino acids. There are 20 different types of amino acid. Transfer RNA molecules carry the amino acids to the ribosome. The messenger RNA is read 3 bases at a time. As each triplet is read, a transfer RNA delivers the corresponding amino acid. This is added to a growing chain of amino acids. Once the last amino acid has been added, the chain folds into a complex 3D shape to form the protein.
Okay, did you hear that?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so I hope it makes sense now. You have the DNA in the nucleus. It gets turned into RNA, which is the messenger, and it goes to then be made into the protein. So when you talk about RNA vaccine, we're talking about a specific type of genetic material. So it is genetic material, but you could see that there's a difference between the DNA and the RNA. Okay, and one of the main differences is that the DNA stays is there all the time. So the DNA, it's kind of like the recipe book is there. It's kind of like preserved, and nothing happens to it all the time. But what happens to the RNA after being turned into the protein? So at body temperature, the mRNA has a half-life between 4.8 and 3.6 minutes. What does that mean? This means that every 3.6 to 4.8 minutes, which is not very long, the mRNA is reduced by half. Okay, so let's say you have, and then by half again after another few minutes, and so on and so on. So let's say we started with 10 copies of this RNA for the chocolate cake, of this recipe. After about 5 minutes, you're gonna only have five copies. After another 5 minutes, you're gonna have 2.5 copies, which is half of the 5. Then after another 5 minutes, you're gonna have another half of the 2.5 that are left, which is 1.25. So by a few minutes, maybe 20 or so, the amount of RNA present is negligible compared to the beginning. So that means that each time you want to make a chocolate cake, for example, you have to make a new copy of the recipe book, if that makes sense. So you go to the recipe book each time you want to make a chocolate cake. You take the copy of the instruction. So you make a photocopy of the page, you make the chocolate cake, and then you wrap it up and throw it in the bin. Okay, you get rid of it after you've used it. I know it sounds a bit inefficient, but it's important because each time you get a copy, it's also a signal to make the chocolate cake. So if that recipe was there all the time, you just keep making more and more chocolate cakes, but maybe you only need 1 today, or maybe there's a party coming up and you need to make 5. Okay, so on the day you need 5 chocolate cakes, you'll get 5 copies of the instruction, which is also a prompt to make that many chocolate cakes. Okay, so that's what happens to RNA. RNA gets degraded. It gets broken down and recycled. Okay, it disappears after it's been used, and after about 20 minutes, it stops. It's almost non-existent. Okay. So your body is very inhospitable to this mRNA, and it gets degraded very rapidly. It doesn't stay around for long. And so your cells have to keep producing new mRNA for the proteins it wants to have. So if it wants certain protein, it needs to keep producing the mRNA, because each time it makes the protein, the mRNA is degraded. If it needs the protein again, it makes it again. It makes the mRNA again. So this is an important concept to understand, that the mRNA doesn't last very long in the cells. Okay. So
Tom,
summary of this section. Sorry?
Are there questions? Can we ask questions?
You can, as long as it's on something I've covered.
Yeah. Just on the last slide. So is there a certain signal that gives the DNA a cue to start making those copies of that RNA?
Yes, so there are signals to do that. So for example, if you eat a lot of sugar, you'll have signals to your cells to start producing insulin, because they need to get the sugar into the cells. Does that make sense? So it's kind of, it responds to the conditions that it's under. So when you've eaten a lot, it produces a protein, a hormone to say we've had enough food, stop, and that's why you stop feeling hungry. Okay, or if you have low blood sugar, it produces a a protein which says, I'm hungry, you know, go and find food, go and eat. Or if you're thirsty, or so it's response to signals that your body's under, and yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, got you.
All right. So the section summary, key takeaway from this section, and I know there's a lot of information, but so I'll put little section summaries where if there's nothing else you got from that section, this is what you should get, okay? So proteins do all the work in the cells. The DNA codes for proteins, but DNA has to be converted into RNA first before it becomes a protein. And then RNA gets degraded very, very quickly and does not last long. Okay, does anybody have any questions from this section, or was that clear? Did it make sense? Okay, I take the silence as it makes sense. Okay, so the next section is viruses, including COVID. So again, I've got another animation to illustrate how viruses work, how they come into your cells and what they do, okay? Because I think it's much easier to watch an animation than for me to explain step by step using text.
Walter Reed discovered the first human virus in 1901. But what is a virus? Viruses are everywhere, from our surroundings to the very food we eat. We ingest, inhale, and take in millions of viruses every second. Pretty much all life on Earth has some kind of virus designed specifically to infect it, including bacteria and even other viruses. Viruses are tiny, very tiny. You cannot visibly see them. In fact, they are so small that if bacteria had eyes, even they wouldn't be able to see all of them. Most scientists accept that viruses are not living, but a complex collection of organic matter that is able to self-replicate. They mostly consist of a shell made of protein, which inside contains either DNA or RNA, with enzymes for replication and manipulation of their genetic materials. Are you still with me? Good. Let's look more closely. A virus is actually just a piece or strand of genetic information, usually DNA or RNA, which can be single or double-stranded. This is the virus's genome. It uses this with the help of various molecular machines to replicate itself. However, it cannot do this alone. It must infect some kind of cell. Cells are the smallest unit of life. They manufacture proteins, replicate DNA, and store resources. This makes them perfect hosts for viruses. Armed with its genetic material, viruses are able to infect healthy cells and convert them into mindless virus-producing robots. The virus uses its outer protein coat, covered in small molecular receptors, to bind and join to the membrane of a cell. This is essential, as it is what determines which cells a virus is able to infect. Once joined, the virus uses several complicated biological pathways in order to force the cell to either accept its genetic material or take in the entire virus itself. Once in the cell, the virus will then begin to use its molecular arsenal to hijack the cell's protein manufacturing systems and DNA replication mechanism. After the virus has integrated itself into the cell's own DNA, the cell will then replicate its DNA and use it to manufacture proteins. Without the cell even knowing, it produces viral protein shells, filling them with virus DNA, effectively making copies of the virus and assembling them. The virus-making machine begins to take over more and more of the cell's protein manufacturing ribosomes, churning out thousands of new viruses which quickly fill the cell. These viruses then cause tension within the cell and by several different means burst from the cell with the intention of infecting new hosts for the same purpose. Seems like relentless biological vandalism to me.
Okay, So that's in a nutshell how viruses work. They are, if I can just go to the next. Okay, so they're little, they're just little like shells, like empty shells, and all they have inside is just some genetic material. Okay, so we learned about where the what happens in your cells. In your cells, usually you have DNA. The DNA gets turned into RNA, and then you have these things called ribosomes, which make the protein. So the virus will take advantage of your ribosomes because they don't have their own ribosomes, which make the protein. And so that's why they need to infect a host cell. So they'll come in, and this is an example of the flu influenza virus, but this is how nearly all viruses work. They come in and they infect the cell. So this is, let's say, like a throat lining cell or something, like one of the cells in your throat or your lungs. It will go into the cell, okay? It will go into the cell, and then it will release its contents. So most importantly, their genetic material. Then once in there, your body will start, your own cell will start to make new copies of the virus because it's injected its RNA or its DNA in there. And so your body is kind of just like, it doesn't discriminate. It just sees RNA. It's like, okay, that's instructions for me to make some proteins. But these instructions code for more viruses. So it's kind of like, it's using your machinery to make itself. Okay, so it gets assembled because it's so small. There's many of them could fit in your cells. They get assembled and they get more and more and more and more. And they then when they get to a certain size, they kind of like rupture the cell and they come out of the cells, and they then, for this one virus that's come in, maybe thousands will come out of that one cell, hundreds or thousands. Okay, and that's how viruses work. So the main thing is that they come in, inject the material, okay, they release the material in your cells, and your cells actually make the viruses after that. And then for every one that comes in, thousands will come out again. And that's why they're so even a small amount of virus can do a lot of damage because they replicate and they divide and divide and divide in your cells. Okay, so, and the coronavirus works in much the same way. Okay, so again, we've got another animation to watch on the coronavirus.
In December 2019, the Chinese authorities notified the world that a virus was spreading through their communities. In the following months, it spread to other countries, with cases doubling within days. This virus is the severe acute respiratory syndrome-related coronavirus 2 that causes the disease called COVID-19 and that everyone simply calls coronavirus. What actually happens when it infects a human, and what should we all do? A virus is really just a hull around genetic material and a few proteins, arguably not even a living thing. It can only make more of itself by entering a living cell. Corona may spread via surfaces, but it's still uncertain how long it can survive on them. Its main way of spreading seems to be droplet infection, when people cough, or if you touch someone who's ill and then your face, say rubbing your eyes or nose. The virus starts its journey here and then hitches a ride as a stowaway deeper into the body. Its destinations are the intestines, the spleen, or the lungs, where it can have the most dramatic effect. Even just a few coronaviruses can cause quite a dramatic situation. The lungs are lined with billions of epithelial cells. These are the border cells of your body, lining your organs and mucosa, waiting to be infected. Corona connects to a specific receptor on its victim's membranes to inject its genetic material. The cell, ignorant of what's happening, executes the new instructions, which are pretty simple: copy and reassemble. It fills up with more and more copies of the original virus until it reaches a critical point and receives one final order: self-destruct. The cell sort of melts away, releasing new corona particles, ready to attack more cells. The number of infected cells grows exponentially. After about 10 days, millions of body cells are infected and billions of viruses swarm the lungs. The virus has not caused too much damage yet, but corona is now going to release a real beast on you, your own immune system. The immune system, while there to protect you, can actually be pretty dangerous to yourself and needs tight regulation. And as immune cells pour into the lungs to fight the virus, corona infects some of them and creates confusion. Cells have neither ears nor eyes. They communicate mostly via tiny information proteins called cytokines. Nearly every important immune reaction is controlled by them. Corona causes infected immune cells to overreact and yell bloody murder. In a sense, it puts the immune system into a fighting frenzy and sends way more soldiers than it should, wasting its resources and causing damage. Two kinds of cells in particular wreak havoc. First, neutrophils, which are great at killing stuff, including ourselves. As they arrive in their thousands, they start pumping out enzymes that destroy as many friends as enemies. The other important type of cells that go into a frenzy are killer T cells, which usually order infected cells to commit controlled suicide. Confused as they are, they start ordering healthy cells to kill themselves too. The more and more immune cells arrive, the more damage they do, and the more healthy lung tissue they kill. This might get so bad that it can cause permanent, irreversible damage that leads to lifelong disabilities. In most cases, the immune system slowly regains control. It kills the infected cells, intercepts the viruses trying to infect new ones, and cleans up the battlefield. Recovery begins. The majority of people infected by corona will get through it with relatively mild symptoms. But many cases become severe or even critical. We don't know the percentage because not all cases have been identified, but it's safe to say that there is a lot more than with the flu. In more severe cases, millions of epithelial cells have died, and with them, the lung's protective lining is gone. That means that the alveoli, tiny air sacs via which breathing occurs, can be infected by bacteria that aren't usually a big problem. Patients get pneumonia, respiration becomes hard or even fails, and patients need ventilators to survive. The immune system has fought at full capacity for weeks and made millions of antiviral weapons. And as thousands of bacteria rapidly multiply, it is overwhelmed. They enter the blood and overrun the body. If this happens, death is very likely. The coronavirus is often compared to the flu, but actually, it's much more dangerous. While the exact death rate is hard to pin down during an ongoing pandemic, we know for sure that it's much more contagious and spreads faster than the flu. There are two futures for a pandemic like corona: fast and slow. Which future we will see depends on how we all react to it in the early days of the outbreak. A fast pandemic will be horrible and cost many lives. A slow pandemic will not be remembered by the history books. The worst-case scenario for a fast pandemic begins with a very rapid rate of infection because there are no countermeasures in place to slow it down. Why is this so bad? In a fast pandemic, many people get sick at the same time. If the numbers get too large, healthcare systems become unable to handle it. There aren't enough resources like medical staff or equipment like ventilators left to help everybody. People will die untreated. And as more healthcare workers get sick themselves, the capacity of healthcare systems falls even further. If this becomes the case, then horrible decisions will have to be made about who gets to live and who doesn't. The number of deaths rises significantly in such a scenario. To avoid this, the world, that means all of us, needs to do what it can to turn this into a slow pandemic. A pandemic is slowed down by the right responses, especially in the early phase, so that everyone who gets sick can get treatment and there's no crunch point with overwhelmed hospitals. Since we don't have a vaccine for corona, we have to socially engineer our behavior to act like a social vaccine. This simply means two things: not getting infected and not infecting others. Although it sounds trivial, the very best thing you can do is to wash your hands. Soap is actually a powerful tool. The coronavirus is encased in what is basically a layer of fat. Soap breaks that fat apart and leaves it unable to infect you. It also makes your hands slippery, and with the mechanical motions of washing, viruses are ripped away. To do it properly, wash your hands as if you've just cut up some jalapenos and want to put in your contacts next. The next thing is social distancing, which is not a nice experience, but a nice thing to do. This means no hugging, no handshakes. If you can stay at home to protect those who need to be out for society to function, from doctors to cashiers or police officers. You depend on all of them. They all depend on you to not get sick. On a larger level, there are quarantines, which can mean different things, from travel restrictions or actual orders to stay at home. Quarantines are not great to experience and certainly not popular, but they buy us, and especially the researchers working on medication and vaccination, crucial time. So if you are put under quarantine, you should understand why and respect it. None of this is fun, but looking at the big picture, it is a really small price to pay. The question of how pandemics end depends on how they start. If they start fast with a steep slope, they end badly. If they start slow with a not so steep slope, they end okayish. And in this day and age, it really is in all of our hands, literally and figuratively. A huge thanks to the experts who helped us on short notice with this video, especially Our World in Data, the online publication for research and data on the world's largest problems and how to make progress solving them. Check out their site. It also includes a constantly updated page on the corona pandemic.
Okay, so I hope that was relatively clear and informative in terms of how the coronavirus works. Again, it just comes in, inserts its genetic material into the cells, just like all other viruses, and infects your cells, and has a number of different things that happen. For example, it wears out your immune system and causes your immune system to overreact if there's too much of the coronavirus there. And so that video also went into some of the things like social distancing. So that video was actually made in March 2020. So that was before the virus, the vaccine was made, and that's why they mentioned it. But still, for a lot of us, the vaccine is still not readily available. So it's still important for us to follow those measures. And we know now for certainty that the COVID is worse than the flu. Okay, the coronavirus is worse than the flu. So if we look at some of the statistics currently, so these are statistics from yesterday. Worldwide, there's been 94 million coronavirus cases in the past year alone. It's been about a year now since the COVID has been out. So this is a good measure of how much damage is done in that year. So in that just 1 year, it's infected 94 million people, and it's killed 2 million people, although 67 million have recovered so far. So as of yesterday, there's still 24 million active cases. If we look at the closed cases, which is 69 million, out of the 69 million, 67 million recovered and discharged, and 2 million of those died. So this is about 3% of the people who had coronavirus, 3% of them died. Okay, so just remember that figure, because when it comes to the flu virus, we'll see that figure is much between 10 and 30 times less than this figure. Okay, in terms of this 3%, the flu is about 0.1%. So that's about 10, it's about 30 times. I'll say 10 to 30 times, depending on how exactly you estimate it, but between 10 and 30 times less than the coronavirus. So obviously this is something that's a lot more drastic than the flu. And cases are rising. So these are the daily cases, over time. So I think there were a lot more cases in March and April because there was not much testing. So these are based on lab confirmed tests. But I think by September, October, there's a lot of testing going on. But we can see as of November, December, January, kind of the holiday season, the cases have really started to spike again. And we can see that in the UK. That's why we've gone back into another lockdown. And that's why things are getting a lot more severe in other countries in terms of the response to the coronavirus. Okay. And yesterday's statistics per country, I just wanted to highlight, we're in the UK, but a lot of brethren on the message are maybe in Brazil, the USA, France as well. And these are the kind of like the countries with the highest deaths. Okay, so USA has 401,000 deaths alone. Brazil has 208, India more, India a bit less. So this is kind of going down. So UK is currently 5th out of all these countries. It's 5th in terms of how many people have died. And of yesterday is 87,295. And these are the new deaths. So these are the new deaths that happened yesterday or the day before when the statistics were collected. And you can see it's an alarming, it's an extra 1,280. So each day is kind of like 87, 88, 89. And before you know it, you'll be a really high number. And that's a lot of people to die on a daily basis. Okay, the USA is really bad with everything going on there with Trump's lack of response to it, and all the conspiracy theories going on there. People are for the first world country, which is like the strongest economy and first in tech and all these things. They have the worst death rates, you know, and still people think it's a conspiracy. Okay, so that's yesterday's statistics. So just to hammer this home, I've got a video comparing COVID-19 and the flu.
Brother Tom, a quick time
yes?
check, 15 minutes, unless you require more time.
15 minutes. I might need a bit more time.
I'm going to say, unless you require more time.
Okay, I mean, I'm not too far off that. I'll probably finish about 15, 20 past 2. I mean, because we normally finish about 2:30. So, yeah, well, I'll just finish this section of the presentation, and should be about 20 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, carry on.
Okay. All right. So this is a video comparing coronavirus and the flu.
Measles is one of the most contagious diseases we know. Just one person is likely to infect between 12 and 18 people. That number is called a disease's basic reproduction number, or R0. Scientists use it to describe how contagious a disease is. Zika, it has an R0 of up to 6.6, super contagious. But the seasonal flu, just a little over 1. And COVID-19, the disease caused by the coronavirus, just about 2. That difference between the flu and COVID-19 doesn't seem so big, especially when you look at them next to these really contagious diseases. Plus, a lot of the symptoms of the flu and COVID-19 are really similar. A fever, cough, they can even both lead to pneumonia, which is ultimately how they can both be fatal. So thinking of COVID-19 and the flu as similar is a common and frankly understandable comparison to want to make.
This is like the flu. It's a lot like the flu.
I like to believe that it's going to end up more like the flu virus.
But wait, let's go back to those R0 numbers again. If the flu has an R0 of 1.3, that means each person gets either 1 or 2 people sick. After 10 rounds, that's 56 total people. And if we run the model with COVID-19's R0 at 2, if one person with it gets 2 people sick, you get 2 people sick. After 10 rounds, that's more than 2,000 people. This does not happen with the flu because COVID-19 is very different. And understanding how is crucial to understanding how dangerous it really is and why we have to take it so seriously.
When we start to look for that comparison to the flu, we almost calm ourselves down. But unfortunately, that's not quite the right reaction.
Every year, the seasonal flu kills as many as 60,000 Americans. As of late March, COVID-19 has killed about 34,000 across the whole world. But scientists expect that number to go up, way up.
Tens of thousands of people a year die of the flu. But we haven't had this for a year yet. We've only had this for a few months. The trouble is coming, and we can predict it. We can see what's coming, at least to a certain extent.
The first really big difference between COVID-19 and the flu is how long it takes you to feel sick. From the moment you're infected with COVID-19, it usually takes 5 days before you start to feel symptoms, but it can take as long as 12 or even 14 days. This is the incubation period, the time between when you catch it and when you first realize you're sick. And scientists think you could be contagious during most of this period. The flu, by comparison, has an average incubation period of just 2 days. You get sick, and pretty soon you feel sick, and you know you're contagious. This is what we're used to. But COVID-19 flips that around. You can be contagious and spreading it around for several days and up to 2 weeks before it even occurs to you that you're sick. And that leads to the next big difference.
No human immune system had seen this virus before. Nobody has a natural immunity to it.
In flu season, there's always a number of people in the population who are already immune to the flu. That can be because they got their flu shot, or maybe they've already had that flu strain. And that limits the spread of the virus. When one person is contagious with the flu, they can only spread it to people who aren't immune, who can only spread it to other people who aren't immune. That's why scientists and doctors urge us to get our flu shot every year. If enough people have immunity, they can kind of shield the virus from reaching others. The more immunized people, the more they can protect those that are susceptible to the virus. But COVID-19 is brand new. None of us have had it before, and there's no vaccine, which means nearly everyone on the planet is susceptible. So when a contagious person who may not even know they're infected comes into contact with others, it can spread like wildfire. And then you see how much more dangerous COVID-19 can be. Only 2% of people with the flu need to be hospitalized, but 20 to even 30% of people who test positive for COVID-19 do. And we're still learning about COVID-19's fatality rate, but scientists think it's somewhere between 1 and 3%. But the flu's rate is even lower, 0.1%. And that's a disease that can kill 60,000 people a year in the US alone. That's what Dr. Anthony Fauci, the US's leading infectious disease expert, tried to clear up to Congress.
People always say, well, the flu does this, the flu does that. The flu has a mortality of 0.1%. This has a mortality of 10 times that. This is a really serious problem that we have to take seriously.
And he's just talking about the average across all age groups. For older people or people with compromised immune systems, it can be way higher. And that's especially scary when you remember all the other things that are different about COVID-19. The infectiousness, how hard it is to know you have it, how susceptible we all are to it. Estimates vary, but some scientists have warned that between 20 and 60% of the world's population could become infected with the virus. Because COVID-19 has no cure and no vaccine, the only defense we have against it is social. We can take ourselves out of the chain, not with immunity, but with social distancing. Just physically not being around anyone and staying home as much as possible. But that only works if each of us takes it seriously, which is why comparing it to the flu, while understandable, is not helpful.
It's natural to want to find a comparison, to want to make this seem small. When we use the flu as the backdrop, it almost numbs us, or it can numb us and make us maybe even feel better about the current situation, because the current situation is bad. So now is not the time to be numb. We need to be vigilant and use our vigilance for useful actions.
Okay, so I hope that was enlightening again. So the important thing from that video was the fact that COVID does kill between 10 and 30 times more than the flu. And not only does it kill more, that many more people, so for like every 100, for every 1,000 people infected, the flu will kill 1, whereas COVID will kill 30, for example, okay? But not only that, is that COVID is also far more infectious, okay? So it's it infects at a much higher rate, twice as many nearly as the flu. And so there's this concept of the R0 number, and we've probably heard it or seen it in the news. Basically, it's just basically for every one person who gets this disease, how many people will they spread it onto? So for H1N1, so this is the one, this is the flu, the flu that you get. For every one person, it'll infect between 1.2 to 1.6 on average, okay? Whereas COVID is much higher at 2 to 2.5. Ebola is 1.62, and there was some other SARS and MERS which infected much, at a much higher rate. So that's why COVID-19 is, it kills more people, at least 10 times more people than the flu, and it affects twice as many. So if you have 10 times more and it affects twice as many, that's actually 20 times more, because it's infecting twice as many and then killing 10 times as many. So you're actually talking somewhere between 20 and 60 times the amount of people killed than with the flu. Okay, so the section summary that we've seen so far to viruses. So the viruses use the body's own machinery to make itself. The R naught number refers to how many people on average one person with the disease will infect. COVID has a much higher severity than the flu, and those were, the previous video was actually from about April last year. But what they were saying has been confirmed over time with the data. We saw the data earlier that actually about 2 to 3% of people are being killed who do get COVID, and that's much higher than the 0.1% of the flu. So this is a serious disease, and one of the biggest problems is being infectious without knowing it, and that's one of the reasons why it's much more infectious, because you pass it without knowing it, and that's one of the reasons why it's, first of all, hard to do anything about, and it's also one of the reasons why people underestimate the virus, because they might not even have symptoms, but they can still pass it on. Okay. So further points was that the health system being overwhelmed is one of the biggest threats. So we looked at that, the curve. Remember we talked about, we didn't talk about, we saw in the video that basically if too many patients appear at once, then the hospitals won't be able to see to them. So for example, if you have one person at a time coming in that needs a ventilator and you only have one ventilator, that's fine. Everybody can get the ventilator and they'll be fine. However, if you have two people at a time coming to use the ventilator and you only have one ventilator, one of them will develop more serious complications. They won't get the treatment that they need from the ventilator, and they're more likely to die just for the fact that they don't have access to the ventilator. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why we do a lot of social distancing and trying to flatten the curve, so that even if we do all get infected, when we do get infected, we have access to the medical staff, we have access to medicines, we have access to the machines that we need. Okay. So what this means is that those who may have survived, even with severe symptoms, are more likely to die if they don't have access to staff and equipment. So that's why you're trying to reduce the amount of people who have the disease at any one time. So think of this like a bacterial infections that usually go to antibiotics. There's a lot of infections that we have that would be lethal without antibiotics, or even malaria. Think about malaria would kill so many more people without anti-malarials, but just the use of malaria medicine reduces the amount of people who die. Or for example, the plague, the bubonic plague, that was so lethal a couple of centuries back, that if you get it now with just a course of antibiotics, you can clear it. But just imagine a time when we ran out of antibiotics, we didn't have enough antibiotics. So you get just a normal bacterial infection that could kill you when normally you'd be able to deal with it. So it's the same thing, just even if someone had severe symptoms and they'd normally be able to overcome it with hospital care, without the hospital care, they wouldn't be able to. Think of it like surgery. People have accidents, or they have certain surgery, this and that. Amputations or whatever, those happen regularly, and in a hospital there's a quite low risk. But if you didn't have a hospital, if you had to amputate yourself, if you had to do all these operations yourself, or if you didn't have the operations done, then you'd be much more likely to die. Okay, so that's why it's important to try and keep the amount of people with disease down. Okay, so the final section for this morning is the immune system and the immune response to disease and viral infections. Am I going too fast for anybody, by the way? Is everybody following?
Yeah, I think your speed's fine, Tom.
Okay, great. Anyway, it's being recorded, and I can hand out the slides, so you can go through the videos are embedded in the slides, so you have access to them. Okay, so we have a disease like COVID or any other viral infection. What does our body do in response? Okay, so the response is your immune cells. Okay, so we have these immune cells, and they're split into two main families. So this is why there's this here. You don't need to remember the individuals. Just remember that there's two main families, and this family here is responsible for something called memory. So they remember infections that you've had. Okay, so when you have an infection and you fight it off, these people will remember it and be able to fight it off very quickly the second time you have an infection. Okay, so again, I have a video to just illustrate this, what happens with the immune system, as I think it'd be it's much nicer with the animations.
Every second of your life, you are under attack. Billions of bacteria, viruses, and fungi are trying to make you their home. So our bodies have developed a super complex little army with guards, soldiers, intelligence, weapons factories, and communicators to protect you from, well, dying. For this video, let's assume the immune system has 12 different jobs. For example, kill enemies, communicate, etc. And it has 21 different cells and 2 protein forces. These cells have up to 4 different jobs. Let's assign them. Here are the interactions. Now, let's make this understandable. First of all, let's add colors to the jobs. Now, let's illustrate the cells. The central color represents the main job of the cell, while the surrounding ones represent secondary duties. Now, the immune system looks like this. Now, the interactions. Isn't this complexity just awesome? For this video, we will only talk about these cells and ignore the rest. So what happens in the case of an infection? It's a beautiful day when suddenly a wild rusty nail appears and you cut yourself. The first barrier of the immune system is breached, your skin. Nearby bacteria seize on the opportunity and enter your wound. They start using up the body's resources and double their numbers about every 20 minutes. At first, they fly under the radar, but when a certain bacteria population is reached, they change their behavior and start to damage the body by changing the environment around them. The immune system has to stop them as fast as possible. First of all, your guard cells, known as macrophages, intervene. They are huge cells that guard every border region of the body. Most of the time, they alone can suffocate an attack because they can devour up to 100 intruders each. They swallow the intruder whole and trap it inside a membrane. Then the enemy gets broken down by enzymes and is killed. On top of that, they cause inflammation by ordering the blood vessels to release water into the battlefield so fighting becomes easier. You notice this as a very mild swelling. When the macrophages fight for too long, they call in heavy backup by releasing messenger proteins that communicate location and urgency. Neutrophils leave their patrol routes in the blood and move to the battlefield. The neutrophils fight so furiously that they kill healthy cells in the process. On top of that, they generate barriers that trap and kill the bacteria. They are indeed so deadly that they evolved to commit suicide after 5 days to prevent them from causing too much damage. If this is not enough to stop the invasion, the brain of the immune system kicks in. The dendritic cell gets active. It reacts to the signals of the soldiers and starts collecting samples from the enemies. They rip them into pieces and present the parts on their outer layer. Now, the dendritic cell makes a crucial decision. Should they call for antivirus forces that eradicate infected body cells or an army of bacteria killers? In this case, antibacteria forces are necessary. It then travels to the closest lymph node in about a day. Here, billions of helper and killer T cells are waiting to be activated. When T cells are born, they go through a difficult and complicated training process, and only a quarter survives. The surviving cells are equipped with a specific setup. And the dendritic cell is on its way looking for a helper T cell with a setup that's just right. It's looking for a helper T cell that can bind to the parts of the intruders which the dendritic cell has presented on its membrane. When it finally finds one, a chain reaction takes place. The helper T cell is activated. It quickly duplicates thousands of times. Some become memory T cells that stay in the lymph node and will make you practically immune against this enemy. Some travel to the field of battle to help out. And the third group goes on to travel to the center of the lymph node to activate a very powerful weapons factory. Like the T cells, they're born with a specific setup. And when a B cell and a T cell with the same setup meet, hell breaks loose. The B cell duplicates rapidly and starts producing millions of little weapons. They work so hard that they would literally die from exhaustion very fast. Here, helper T cells play another important role. They stimulate the hard-working factories and tell them, "Don't die yet, we still need you. Keep going." This also ensures that the factories die if the infection is over, so the body doesn't waste energy or hurt itself. But what is produced by the B cells? You've heard of them, of course, antibodies. Little proteins that are engineered to bind to the surface of the specific intruder. There are even different kinds of antibodies that have slightly different jobs. The helper T cells tell the plasma cells which type is needed the most in this particular invasion. Millions of them flood the blood and saturate the body. Meanwhile, at the site of infection, the situation is getting dire. The intruders have multiplied in number and start hurting the body. Guard and attack cells fight hard, but also die in the process. Helper T cells support them by ordering them to be more aggressive and to stay alive longer. But without help, they can't overwhelm the bacteria. But now the second line of defense arrives. Billions of antibodies flood the battlefield and disable lots of the intruders, rendering them helpless or killing them in the process. They also stun the bacteria and make them an easy target. Their back is built to connect to killer cells, so they can connect and kill the enemy more easily. Macrophages are especially good at gnoming up the bacteria which antibodies have attached to. Now, the balance shifts. In a team effort, the infection is wiped out. At this point, millions of body cells have already died. No big deal, the losses are quickly replenished. Most immune cells are now useless, and without the constant signals, they commit suicide, so as not to waste any resources. But some stay behind, the memory cells. If this enemy is encountered ever again in the future, they will be ready for it and probably kill it before you even notice. This was a very simplified explanation of parts of the immune system at work. Can you imagine how complex this system is? Even at this level, when we ignore so many players and all the chemistry. Life is awfully complicated, but if we take the time to understand it, we always encounter endless wonders and great beauty.
Okay, so that was an animation of what happens when you have an infection. That was a bacterial infection, but it works more or less the same with a viral infection in terms of how you get the cells coming and fighting first, and then you have the T cells and the B cells, which are the ones which have the memory. So remember, after they finish fighting, all the cells die, apart from the B cells and the T cells, which have a memory. And it's these B cells which produce what are called antibodies. Okay, and these antibodies remember kind of which virus or bacteria they were fighting, and that's why you can check for these antibodies in someone's blood and see if they had COVID, for example, or any other disease. Okay, so that's what it means to. That's what the antibodies are, and these two are very effective at fighting the infection. But the thing is that they take, as you could see, they're not the front line. This is the front line because they act much quicker. But because these cells are so specialized and so effective, they take a while to learn the new disease, the new pathogen or whatever. Okay, that's what they use. But it takes them a while to understand or to remember, to develop that memory. Okay, so just as a graph to illustrate this, when the first time a virus attacks your body, this is the amount of antibodies in your blood. Okay, you don't have many for a long time. It takes about 15 days to get a certain amount of the antibody. And remember, the antibody is produced by the B cell. So this is the one that remembers. Okay, so it takes a long time to respond, and so in this time, all the other responders are responding. And sometimes your system can be overwhelmed because it takes you a long time to develop all these antibodies. But maybe by that time there's too much of the virus, or maybe there's already too much damage done to your body and you can end up dying. That's why a lot of things can kill you. Even though your body responds to it, the response might be a bit too slow, a bit too late. Okay. So let's say you have this infection, you develop some symptoms, and your antibodies are made, and you get rid of the virus or the bacteria. So you get infected a second time, but you can see the response is so much more rapid that in just 2 days you have a response which took your body 15 days to do before, and by 10 days you have this is a logarithmic scale. So for every one you go up, this is times 10. So when you have 100, this is 100 times 100 to the power of 10. So this is like trillions, many more trillions more antibodies than there were down here or than here. So this is one antibody here. This up here will be like 1 trillion antibodies. Okay. the way this would, but obviously showing a 1 in a trillion on a graph is not so practical. So that's why you use something called log scale, which makes it a bit more visible. Okay, so so yeah, so just remember this is about 1 trillion times more, and you can see that's happening in 10 days, whereas before it took 15 days just to get to 1. Now it takes 10 days to get to 1 trillion because your body's now remembering on all these things. Okay, but this is, so it takes a while for your body to respond the first time, and the response doesn't come so quickly or so fast or so strong, because it's almost like your body's caught off guard. But the second time your body's prepared and they're ready, your body's ready. Okay, so that's an important concept to remember when we come to immunization, to vaccination and immunization, because it uses this understanding of how these things work in order to prepare you, so that when you do get a virus, you have this response straight away, rather than having to take this long time to learn. Okay, so section summary for the immune system. The immune system is our defense against pathogens, bacteria, but this also including viruses, because it's in the context of the coronavirus. The immune system is made of 2 parts. Initiating the second part, which is the more effective part, can take a long time, by which time serious illness or death may have occurred. And this part of the immune system is responsible for memorizing, so it has the memory, okay, of the pathogens, and neutralize them very quickly the second time. And sometimes it's so quickly that you won't even realize any symptoms develop. So that's why sometimes when you're around someone who has the flu, they will pass, if they cough, they'll pass that flu onto you. But sometimes you don't get the flu or the symptoms of the flu because your body will neutralize it so quickly because it's immune to that flu. It's seen that flu before. Okay, or a cold or any other thing. You know, we're constantly facing all these viruses and bacteria, but your body's used to dealing with them, so it kind of deals with them very, very quickly, very, very easily. Okay, so we've come to the end of this first session, and so we'll just do an overarching summary of this first session, the key takeaways from this morning session. I know it's a lot of information, but I hope it made sense. I hope the animations also helped. But the summary of this is that, first of all, RNA is a messenger between your DNA and your ribosomes to make proteins. And on top of that, it's degraded very quickly after use. So remember, we're talking about the RNA vaccines. So that's why I'm stressing this point. So viruses hijack your protein-making machinery and make more viruses. COVID is a very serious disease, and it doesn't affect everyone in the same way, which makes it more dangerous, but it's much more, has a higher infection rate and a death rate than the flu. So it's not comparable to the flu. It's at least 10 times, but anywhere between 10 and 30 times more dangerous than the flu. Your immune system is in charge of fighting disease, but it can take a long time, as we saw. So, you know, you get the disease the first time, it can take your body 15 days, 20, sometimes up to 40 days to respond. And in that time, if it's a particularly serious virus or bacteria, you can have you can die by that time. You can die by the time your body's responding very effectively. Okay. And then the last thing is that it's very important to have a limited amount of people sick at once. And this gives all the sick people a good chance of recovery. And this is what we refer to as reducing the curve. So you still have enough ventilators for everybody who's sick right now. You still have enough doctors for everyone who's sick right now. You still have enough treatments for everyone who's sick right now. And if you look at the amount of people who are dying, it's reduced. It gets reduced the fewer people there are who are sick. But the more people who are sick, the higher percentage of people who will die. Okay, so that is the end of this morning's session. So this is just a background of RNA, viruses, COVID, and the immune system, which are the important concepts, which we'll then take on to this evening, and that's when we're going to deal with vaccines and COVID. So I hope that was informative and not overwhelming, and that everyone got something from it. Do we have any questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
Just some clarification. You know, when you say the body makes antibodies,
Yes.
so you said something about trillions of antibodies. So
yes.
do they get stored somewhere? So when say that you get that virus again or bacteria or whatever, those trillions of antibodies are already produced to fight it off.
The antibodies aren't already produced, but the cells which can make those specific antibodies. Remember, the antibody, you need a different antibody for each pathogen, so each virus or each bacteria. So those cells that produce the antibodies, they remain. Remember, they have a memory.
Okay, so the memory is there, so it doesn't have to be. You don't have to study this new virus again.
Yeah, so they have the memory. They know what it looks like. So the next time they can act instantly rather than waiting many days to do it. And then on top of that, the memory cells also then divide. So so for every one cell they divide into 1,000 cells. So all these thousands of cells can now produce that same antibody because it's kind of like a copy of the memory cell. Yeah.
Do you know instant? Is that like a day, couple of hours, or?
It depends how much of the virus you have. It depends on all these things, but usually you don't even notice. Usually it's minutes, sometimes an hour, sometimes a day, 2 days. So sometimes you don't even notice that your body has dealt with this threat, and it occurs all the time. I don't know if you caught it in one of those in one of the first videos about the viruses. Every time you inhale, you're inhaling viruses and bacteria. These things are everywhere. They're in the air. You know, Ellen White talks about. The seeds of death and decay are in the air, but your immune system deals with it so effectively that you don't even notice that you're fighting viruses. Maybe even now, right now, your body's killing viruses and bacteria, and you're just really not aware. So it really depends on also how much of the virus you take in at once, how fast, whether you'll develop symptoms or not. But most of the time, it's really you don't just develop any symptoms or mild symptoms.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
For your immune system, Tom, to be that strong enough to fend everything off, how come some people do that and others don't? What is it that you have to do to actually strengthen that immune system to fight off that disease?
So there's a lot of factors that go into it. There's genetics. There's one of the videos showed there's loads of different immune cells. Okay, and so, some parts of them are better at fighting certain pathogens than others. So it depends how strong your compartment is there. Also, what you do, your lifestyle can affect your immune system. Some people have genetic traits which mean the immune system is not so strong. You know, things like diet, exercise, strengthen the immune system. But unfortunately, what happens is over time, especially as we age, our immune system becomes less and less effective. And unfortunately, and it's a reality. So that's why younger people tend to do better with most infectious diseases. There's not many infectious diseases which you find that affect younger people more than older people. It either affects them equally or it affects the older population more than the younger. So yeah, it also depends which viruses and things like that you've been exposed to in the past. Are they similar to that other virus, which means it has less to learn? And yeah, so if it's been exposed to a similar virus, then it's more equipped to deal with the virus that you're now presented with.
And also, how do you turn on genes? How do you know it mentioned something about genes being turned on?
Yeah, so the genes being turned on, your genes are very dynamic. They're switched on and off depending on what you need and when you need them. You know, think about them like things in your house. You turn on the heating in winter because it gets cold. You turn on your lights at night because it gets dark, but then you turn them off as soon as it stops being dark. So you have tens of thousands of genes and they get switched on depending on the different things you do and different things you need. So according to your mood, how you're thinking, what you're eating, what you're doing, are you exercising, are you stressed? you know, and there's so many different variables that it's different. You can't really turn your genes on and off like that as an individual. They kind of have to get turned on in response to what you do. So that the best thing to do is, and they get turned on as a group. So it's different. You can't turn on one specific gene or another specific gene. What you have to do is to just do
So
things
it's
that generally benefit.
It's automatic. You have really nothing to do with it, or you do by you know, by what you're thinking.
Yeah,
Is
so
that-
you have broad control of over what happens to a certain extent, but not too much. You don't have fine control, because it'd be overwhelming to deal with all the different genes, switching them on and off at certain times. It'd be impossible. You know, so what you do makes your body then respond, but your body's in automatic mode a lot. You know, you're not controlling your immune cells. You're not controlling. They're just responding to the viruses that's there, the bacteria, or whether you've had a lot of sugar, it will make the immune system less effective, and you know, things like that. So they're just responding to the broad conditions you're under. Okay, so we'll close there, just for sake of time. I hope it's been informative. So if you'd like to join me for a word of prayer. Okay, let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this wonderful human organism that you've made. We thank you for all the things you do for us. Thank you for our immune systems, which keep us safe. We thank you, Lord, for all the processes that are going on in our bodies that we're really not even, we don't even know go on, Lord, let alone those we do know that go on. Pray that you may help us become acquainted with the human system, Lord, and we just thank you, Lord, for the knowledge that you give us in this day and age that, that's been built on a lot of people who've gone before and made step-by-step discoveries. And pray you may grant us the wisdom that we need, the knowledge, Lord, to be able to understand what to do at this time, to be able to debunk conspiracy theories, Lord, and help us understand what is the best to do for ourselves, not only for ourselves, but also for our neighbors. Lord, we ask and pray you may continue to be with us this Sabbath day. Help us keep our minds stayed upon you, and we thank you so much for your blessings. Please be with us now. We ask and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen, and thank you.